Everyone, lovely to meet you. I know some of you from Australia, some of you from all around the world. I met Jason back when we were first year uni. We went to Sydney Uni together, and we're good mates. And we caught up when I was in Sydney. I'm now based in Singapore/San Francisco. I'm here in Palo Alto right now. And Sarah, she's just a joy to have worked with at Google. You'll see what amazing presentation this will be. And we worked together at Google. Tremendous respect for her, both professionally and also personally. And we had her speak to Zooglers and also ex-Meta people in prior months. And when Jason shared more about what was perhaps needed for the Atlassian community, I immediately thought of Sarah. I was at Google for a long time, and just feel for everyone who was impacted in this way. I started a company called Key.ai to really unlock opportunities for people who may have been impacted by what's happening that we're on this call for, but also new opportunities. A lot of you have great startup ideas, could join other people to collaborate, but we're here to join as a community. I'm always available, chris@key.ai, if you want to email me and just chat about anything of how we can bring the community closer together to help you advance your opportunities and have other amazing speakers like Sarah come and speak to all of you. So I think I ate up the 2 minutes. Back to you, Jason. Thank you.
Cool. No, thank you, Chris. So yeah, look, I think we're at 9:05 now, so perfect timing. I just again, so let's kick off. Again, really honored and privileged to have Sarah Karam, our speaker today. I'm kind of giving her time and impart her wisdom on this topic of, hey, you've left Atlassian, so what next? And with again, I know it's been a really hard time for us all, and again, really thanks to everyone for jumping into our I guess our ex-Atlassian Slack channel and supporting each other. It was a shock. I mean, it's been the largest restructure Atlassian has done by far, and that just sort of left us hanging. I think a lot of us, right, on hey, what do we do next? And I think there's a real need for us to sort of be able to seek out experience, mentorship, guidance on what to do next. And as Chris mentioned, I've known Chris since university, and in this kind of time when everything seems really tough, bleak, the universe finds a way. And Chris actually reached out to me back in November, and when I was trying to come back from sabbatical to Atlassian, I was having a very hard time finding a role. And Sarah actually ran a session for, I think at the time, Googlers and Amazon, what do you call Amazoners, who were impacted, and her guidance mentorship has been absolutely amazing, helping me navigate that time. And then 10 weeks later, again in March. And so when the impact happened, thanks to Sarah, I felt I knew what I needed to do straight away. And so hopefully this helps you right now, but they really are lifelong skills. And again, huge thanks to Chris and setting up the amazing Google network where, they've built an amazing sort of ecosystem and community for those who have left the company, but doing things like finding jobs and building companies and getting help like this. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jason, for the kind introductions. And yeah, big plus one that this is the power of community. So I'm going to jump right in. I'd encourage you all to ask questions. I do want this to be engaging, and there'll be a couple of moments where I ask you questions. So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. I recognize we end at 45 past, so I'm going to try to fly through this, but please just ask questions. I would urge you to chat them, might be easier. But if there's something you want to say, just raise your hand and I'll pay attention. So a little bit about me, and then I'll dive right in. So like Chris mentioned, I worked at Google for a long time. We overlapped, and I'm grateful for that. I was in different parts of the company, but ended as a managing director in partnerships working on the Play Store. So what I loved about my job at Google was I got to meet with all different types of companies and people, which I've continued in my new role. So the last few years, I've been working as an executive coach, helping leaders who feel like they're in really stormy seas, and that can look and feel different for each person, but it's obviously your own experience, and then helping them feel like they're really navigating with purpose and clarity. So if you're in a situation where you feel very lost, very, nauseous and seasick, that's the sweet spot. That's where I find it's really helpful to work with a coach. And I'll share some of the frameworks that I've been working on that I've been using with leaders especially who are in that time of life where they're really questioning, what do I really want to do? What will bring me a lot of joy? I feel like I've been on a treadmill a lot of my life and not really sure if it's for me. that is a key moment. And actually, post a layoff is an ideal time to force those conversations because you're whether you want it or not, you're kind of in that moment where you have to ask really big questions in your life. Um, so I'm going to jump right in to ask you all a question. One of my favorite movies is Inside Out. I don't know if you've all seen it. It's an animated movie, so sorry, I'm making, it's obviously not it's not highbrow to put it that way, but I love that it unpacks human emotion, which I think is incredibly uncomfortable for most of us. It certainly is for me, especially in the workplace. We don't often talk about emotions. It's like gross, don't talk about that. But I find it can be such a skill to actually figure out what you're feeling in a moment and therefore move forward maybe a little differently based on that. So if you could all just take a second and reflect on what are you feeling right now? Which of these emotions, any other emotion, and just it can be more than one emotion. I'll start. I'm feeling anxiety. I don't love speaking into groups. It's not my natural talent, and I generally get very anxious. A bit of fear because I just related. I feel like I'm going to mess it up. But also joy. I love doing the work I do, so this is meaningful to me. So all of those can coexist. But those are some of the feelings I'm feeling. If you could just type in the chat any emotions you're feeling. There's no right or wrong. Jason, anxiety, embarrassment. I'm there with you. I feel you. Alex, sadness, anxiety. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Sadness was my favorite character in the movie, by the way, if any of you have seen it. Anxiety, a bit of fear. Yep. Anxiety. Anxiety is such a great character, right? Or like I think it's just such a great emotion because I find that it's so similar to joy. Apparently, like a lot of the ways we express anxiety can look like we're happy, which is really interesting. Annoyance. Yep, not a great time to be job hunting. I feel you, Helen. Excitement. Yeah, opportunity. Anxiety and fear. Love it. Thank you all for sharing. And I think this practice of just taking a minute to recognize your own emotions can really help when you're in that job seeking or personal understanding quest because it is I don't know if anyone else can relate to this, but often when I'm in moments of anxiety, my default response is to overfunction, which means that I will just start doing things. So if I'm anxious, I'm going to start sending emails and applying to things and writing, kind of just really a little bit on autopilot. Which not to say that that's bad. Obviously it's a very high performer response to to life when things go wrong. To like let me clean the kitchen. It's not quite not always productive in an emotional way, but can feel productive on the surface level. But just knowing why you're taking an action like that can really make sure you're putting your best foot forward. Because probably not the best time to apply for a job when you're incredibly anxious and you're kind of like rage applying. So taking a beat and asking, is this how I want to move forward can really help. So in this moment, a lot of you have shared emotions like anxiety, like fear, embarrassment, sadness. All of these are incredibly valid and normal. So I think again, our default in the movie really deals with this is these bad emotions are things we should push away and get into the good emotions of joy and all the other things. And the takeaway from the movie, spoiler alert, is that's really not good for us. That these are all important emotions to feel and they have a time and a place. And it's not, pushing away the bad ones, quote unquote, is not actually going to help us to move through these tough times. So just, acknowledge, validate, ask yourself, how am I feeling today? And not, shaming yourself for any specific emotion. A second thing is to really just not make it personal. These are corporate decisions, layoffs. They're not no more, no less. They're not a reflection of you as a human being or of your performance. It's very natural to start ruminating and thinking, 3 months ago, when I was in this meeting with this person, should I have said that? If I didn't say it that way, would this have been my outcome? It's not helpful. You can't control that, nor is it, the reason for layoffs. And just being mindful, similarly to the emotional piece, managing your focus. It's easy to go through this rumination phase where our brains are overwhelmed with reflecting on the past. And of course, reflection with the goal of outcomes is great. But if you find yourself ruminating where you're just obsessing over something that happened in the past, ask yourself, how can I move into a place I can control, which is right now? My mindset, my breath, my actions. So as much as you can just get better, because this is a muscle. I really believe this. This is not something you're born good at. None of us are born good at this. To just get better at noticing your own emotions, your own mindset, whether you're ruminating and bringing it back to the present, what you can control. And then this is a question I often get post layoffs from clients or friends. How do I talk about this? And should I tell people? Should I tell future employers? And my approach has always been to be as honest as you feel comfortable being. That doesn't mean you have no boundaries and that you want to talk about this all the time with everyone, but I'm sure you probably have some friends and family who might be high empath and want to ask you all the time, how are you doing? Are you okay? And there might be times when you want that. There might be times when you don't, and you don't want to talk about, what you're doing in your job search, and just having those boundaries, having clarity on what you want from people, especially family, close friends, and when you need it is going to be really important, so that you don't get sucked into spirals of, kind of shame or getting asked questions when you're not in the mindset for it. But of course, getting comfortable with tapping in to your network, which we'll talk about in a minute, is going to be incredibly important, because that's how you're going to find your next job. It's not going to be through a cold outreach on LinkedIn, or certainly unlikely to be the main way you get opportunities. It will be through the people who you already know. So, how do you tap into that? How do you speak up for what you're looking for? Um, I love this quote from Winston Churchill. I never know if quotes are attributed to the right people, but it can not feel like it in the moment. I think when you're in a post-layoff mindset, it can feel incredibly overwhelming and all the things. But looking back on these moments is often when we've experienced the most growth and the most understanding of what we want, who the real friends are in our lives, who are the people that that really care about us. So the more you can see this, I know it's hard to feel this every minute of every day, but that it will actually be an incredibly useful time for you if you can leverage it, if you can feel that inertia to make change, to learn more about yourself and others. So with that, a couple of things on the mindset piece. So one thing I notice with most of the clients I coach, and this was certainly me, by the way, we assign a lot of identity to where we work. So when we meet people, I think this is true in Australia, you can all correct me, but I think it's not too different from the US in this way. The first question you get asked is, what do you do? It's rare that you get asked, like, so what village are you from? Which is what people typically ask. Where I'm from Lebanon originally, and I never get asked where I work there, which is quite funny. Um, but that identity being so closely tied to where we work can mean when we go through a layoff, it's incredibly disorienting. Because when we meet people, what do you say when somebody asks, where do you work? And then it can lead to this really windy conversation about, like, do you want to mention the layoff? Do you not? If you do, how do you do it? And is it like a 5 minute ongoing? And I would highly encourage all of you. I think these moments, even if it's only for a week or a little amount of time, even if it's for if you're job searching for many months, or if you decide on a totally different career path, um, taking the time to not have that armor of your work identity as your primary identity, which can be a crutch, right? Because that's just who you are, right? If that's like, oh, I'm an engineer at Atlassian, I'm a program manager at Google, I'm whatever, a PM at Meta, that just becomes you, and then that limits you, right? Because that's you. That's kind of you in a nutshell. So how might you take this time to ask, how will I identify myself? What are the other elements of me that I can bring to my introductions? Do I want to say I'm a father or a mother? Do I want to say I'm a runner? I'm an idealist. I'm a dreamer, whatever it is. But taking the time to ask who am I if not just my company is very healthy. No matter where you could go on to another company next week, but how can you take this time to not default your identity to one single company assignment? And similarly, there's a coach I love out there called Steve Schlafman, based in New York, and he talks about these moments post layoff or post a major shift in life where you maybe change careers or change jobs as the opportunity to take a downshift. So often in the workplace, we don't have time. Helen, you were just mentioning Atlassian, like we typically are running between meetings, we need to start 5 minutes late. Like that, even that is such a good example of, it's just like we got to move quickly. We got to have this culture of, just moving from thing to thing. But now is a time where you can, I guess, take advantage of that downshift and think about questions like, am I actually living a life that is my life that I wanted? Or is this, trying to fit into some mold that was what my parents wanted for me or what society wanted of me? And is it really me? And how do I even know that? And am I actually moving towards a direction that is right for me? Or am I moving somewhere that I don't like that version of myself? That's not how I want to be. And similarly, I mentioned that many high performers I work with tend to manage their anxiety through control, which is, again, it's a human response. It's a survivorship response. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but how might you notice that more and more and see, do you need to have control in this moment? How can you get more comfortable not having control? Because that's the reality of the life we live in. And this is going to be like a theme throughout the whole presentation that there used to be a time, I want to say pre-pandemic, when I think the norm wasn't so much change and so much upheaval. And this is just the world we live in now. I think people always have a new version of a boogeyman, whether it's AI or global unrest, political polarization. There's just like insert something that people will point to as this is causing so much anxiety and uncertainty. My instinct is that's just the world that we're going to be in for a long time. It could be forever, it could be for a time period, I don't know. But that's not going to change. So knowing that's not going to change, how do you change your way to react to uncertainty, to anxiety, to ambiguity, so that you can thrive in it? All the skills you've gained at Atlassian and any other company you've worked in are incredibly valuable. But how do you translate them? Because they don't always translate to a world full of uncertainty, an AI first world. So how do you, or different types of companies, different stages of companies. So how do you create your own system that can adapt and that can shift the translation to different situations? Okay, jumping in. So, please, yeah, feel free. I'll keep an eye on the chat. But if you have any questions, don't feel like you have to save them to the end. Feel free to ask throughout. So I'm going to focus on three areas that can really help shift you from, okay, I know I did some things at Atlassian. I know I did good work, but it's kind of like I'm not in the mood for a job hunt. I don't know how to do that in this world because it's such a fast-paced AI world and it seems like the rules are being rewritten daily for how do you apply for companies, how do you position yourself. So how do I go through that process? And um, where I've broken it down into three key elements. And this is something that I'll share some examples of people post-layoff who've gone through this and how it's had an impact. So the first thing is taking this time to really know who you are. And I mean that on a more fundamental level than just building a resume. A resume shouldn't be where you start here. Because if you're starting with your resume, you're skipping kind of some of the fundamentals. The resume should just be an expression of some of these things, and it probably won't be the main thing that gets you a job or doesn't get you a job. If it is, it's very unlikely. That's not a high number of jobs that are gotten simply through your resume. So starting with your strengths, what makes you really good at what you do? And I would advise you to not focus on your job title here, like almost throw away your job title. Doesn't matter what your job title is. This is more about the problems that you've solved. And that's really key to start, because I see this again and again when I work with clients who are in that job search mode, that they kind of jump into, well, here's what I was in charge of Meta's, whatever it is, like the strategy for VR at Meta. And I led this team to make these changes. They kind of go straight into the tactics of the area that they worked in. And for somebody with a lot of context, that might make sense, but for many people, that will not be compelling. It's not really clear why that mattered. What was actually hard about what you did? How did you do it differently from the person sitting next to you? So I would highly encourage you to do this from a mindset of talking to people who don't have a lot of familiarity with what you did at Atlassian or any other company, and starting with just what was the problem that you solved and why was it an important problem to solve? So shifting that approach from I worked in Meta on the VR side, helping to wrangle teams together with something more fundamental. That Meta was going through a really complex time, trying to figure out its strategy in this really complex space that was fundamental to the company for these reasons. And I approached it this way. And the reason I chose that way was because of this, complexity in the organization. And I was able to wrangle teams despite blah, blah, blah. So really just, I think some people would call this selling your work, but I would think of it much more as being really clear on why it mattered, who did it matter to, and what did it result in. But if you're able to frame your work and your strengths in the way it's described in part A here, you're already differentiating yourself. Most people I see apply for jobs do this very poorly. So I would say this is already a big differentiator if you can just communicate the problems that you've solved over the last few years in a way that makes the context clear to an outsider. And I have a prompt in a bit that will help you do this with your favorite LLM. And then the second part of this knowing yourself and your strengths is what actually energizes you? What do you enjoy? That could be the same as your strengths. It's not always. Sometimes the things we're really good at, we hate doing. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that, but it's not always overlapping. And knowing both can really help make sure what you do next is going to bring out the absolute best in you. Because if you can not just work on things you're good at, but the types of activities that you lose your sense of time in, that you kind of just hours go by and you're still doing it and you still feel energized. Or that when you were at Atlassian, you volunteered for. You actually, enjoyed them enough that you would do them in time that you didn't have. That's going to make a big difference in deciding what you take on next, making sure it brings you energy, it doesn't drain your energy. And the last piece here relates to your strengths, but it's a little different. Based on what you do in your current role or in your previous roles, what would you say you're in the top 5% in that skill? And that's something that you feel really strongly. This does not need to be a functional skill. Like it could be writing code, it could be creating briefing docs or something, but it doesn't need to be. It's often more diagonal than that or more horizontal than that. So, for example, negotiation, high stakes negotiation. I've worked with some people because I was in partnerships they are so good at that. It's what they love doing. They almost studied it, in college to some degree. That's how in depth they were. Or mentoring. I know a lot of people at every level of every company who just are really good at mentoring. They love doing it. Even interviewing is a skill that I notice some people are just incredibly naturally talented at, and they love doing it. So what is that for you? Taking the time to really ask, what is the skill that I'm actually very exceptionally good at, and I have a desire to do. And the reason to be clear on what that is to make sure you keep getting better at that every day. I think we have a culture in the workplace, unfortunately, that's about rounding out your weaknesses and kind of getting better and becoming this very well-rounded person. But we don't have as much of a culture of getting really, really, really good at the things that you're actually very good at. And in an AI, forward world where a lot of parts of our jobs are getting more automated, being clear on what differentiates you. And this doesn't need to be something that you can't augment with AI, but ideally it's not something that AI does, entirely by itself. That will really, again, separate you from the pack. And then, yeah, building on that, I think in this world, what made you incredibly strong at your job 3 years ago, and the way you communicate that in 2026 and beyond might look very unsustainable. So if you are incredibly strong at writing code or QA or something, the skills that went into that are likely very sustainable. So because you can communicate the skills that go into that without it being, for example, like high attention to detail and effectively preempting user needs. But it's all about how you communicate it. Because if you communicate skills that are now very clearly being outsourced to AI agents, then you will, again, undermine your narrative. So just being very mindful. And once you complete the exercise in the previous slide, how do you make sure you're vetting it? Like, does this sound like it's now a task for AI? Which is, again, very much would be undermining the value that you're bringing to a business. So I mentioned like there's so many prompts you could use here, and I'm not going to spend time on these. I'll share this presentation afterwards, but throughout I've added some prompts that can help you so that you're not starting from a blank piece of paper. You work with your favorite LLM to really, better clarify and communicate what are these strengths. How do I make sure that I'm understanding how to present them to an audience, whether it's an employer or just people around me in my network. Okay, so we talked about strengths, and this is all part of that stage one of really knowing yourself, which is the most fundamental way you can use your time for the better right now. And then the second part of this is your values. And values, again, are something we don't often talk about at work in a clear way. I think there's a lot of teams will go through values exercises, but it's rarely clear how to use them, especially on an individual level. But as you go through a job search, the values that you hold are you might not explicitly be thinking about them or explicitly be saying them out loud, but they are informing what is drawing you to certain roles or certain companies, and they're informing what's pulling you away. But unless you can unpack them, you won't really know why. And it might be hard for you to decide, is this a good company for me? Is this a good team for me? Is this a good manager for me? So the more you can bring your values to the forefront for yourself, understand the through line throughout your career, what have been the values that have caused you to act a certain way, that will really help you make decisions. Because again, and I'll share some examples, I've seen some leaders when you're faced with a decision on a job to take post-layoff, often there's an urgency to act and an urgency to take a job, which often can be something that might actually conflict with your values. And how do you make that decision, right? Because it's hard in the moment when you're under a lot of time pressure to say no to something that might be a really bad fit for you. So if you take this, take the time to do this exercise now, it'll help prepare you and make sure you're not, put into a corner where you're saying yes to something that might be a really bad fit. So I have some questions here to ask yourself on whether or not the work that you did, and this doesn't necessarily need to be these peak moments in your career don't need to be strengths necessarily. It could just be things you remember, moments where you remember like, oh, that was a really interesting time, or we came together as a team to solve this really gnarly problem. And look back at those moments and then really try to understand what was I prioritizing? Was it collaboration? Was it recognition? Was it complexity? Do I love working in complexity? Because I get bored, doing standard things. But taking the time to go back and just, word vomit kind of everything at first, and then go through and actually understand, try to look for the values in your work, can really help make sure you understand what's been motivating you throughout your career. And then similarly, what are the values that you really don't, you can't work under conditions where that is the primary value, or that goes, deeply. It's a counter value, I guess, to something that you deeply believe. Making sure you know what those are, and then similarly, when many of you, I'm sure, have been mentors for others and are people seek you out, prior colleagues or people you've known for a while, they'll come to you and say, hey, Jason, I really need help with this. Like, I'd love to talk to you. What is it that they talk to you about? What are the types of themes that come to you again and again from people in your network, or people you used to work with? Because that tells you a clear story of what is it that people see in me, in my strengths and what I value that seem to come up again and again. And then lastly, this is something that I know hard to answer in an abstract, but what would you do if you had money was no object? Like what are things that really excite you, similar to the previous question, but more that things that really, you value them because of a certain joy they bring you, trying to understand why, what are those things and what's the common thread in the values. So, values are, again, a word we don't use often. It's kind of a fluffy word, but I think they can really help you tell a story of what you're going to be drawn to and companies that are a good fit or a bad fit for you. Um, I'm going to share this. So I think I just shared this as some workplace values to help ground yourself. And what are a few that when you see them on the page, you're like, yep, that is an absolute non-negotiable for me. I care so much about creating change or about curiosity. Like that's one for me. I cannot, if I work somewhere where people are like, I don't care, I don't want to know, that really turns me off. And it's a deal breaker for me because it just, I don't know, it's something that I can't live without. That's how a value should feel. It shouldn't be negotiable. If you're like, well, I like to work somewhere with inclusion, but if you work somewhere that's not a top value, would you care? And if the answer is not really, it's not a value. It's just a nice to have, but it should be a non-negotiable. Um, and then something that again, so this is moving from yourself. Now that's the most important phase, I'll say. So if you're going to spend a lot of time in the next couple of weeks or a few weeks setting aside an hour to job search, if you find yourself immediately going to where am I going to work? What are the companies? I would highly encourage you to take a beat and go back to, do you know your strengths? Do you know your values? Have you written them down? Spending an hour on that is incredibly valuable and will bring you much more clarity when you start going into the phase of reaching out to your network, looking for jobs. So if you haven't done that, if you have not done that recently, because it is something I wouldn't count on. If you did it 5 years ago, it might have to be refreshed. I highly recommend taking the time to do that, and it will be time well spent. And ideally, with this is a community you've got around you, so you can share with others. You can ask them, "What do you think? Does this resonate?" So tap into your network as you do it because you'll get extra useful data. So you've done that exercise. I'm fast forwarding. So you've all done that. Now what do you do? How do you know if a certain job or a certain company is a good fit for you? And in this stage, this is where I notice it can be really hard, especially post-layoff, because it's, again, a time of pressure, a time of a lot of emotions, a lot of anxiety, to push yourself to be selective. I think the mindset is often, especially in this market, I'll just take what I can get. Whatever I can find, I'm going to go for because it feels scarce, it feels stressful, it feels like a lot of companies are laying off people. I want to just, be secure, especially if you've got a history of knowing yourself that you tend to bias to security, and a lot of that will be for legitimate reasons, financial reasons or family, upbringing reasons. So while that is not a negative thing, that's just how many of us are wired. How do we make sure we understand why we're saying yes to a role or saying no to a role or to a pursuit? And this is where I like to think of it as two list method. I think that's the Warren Buffett method, but not for the reason he says it. I would start with what are the priorities that I have when I look for a new role? And this should be a very expansive list. So it doesn't need to be, it could be 3 pages, it could be 3 paragraphs, it doesn't need to be long, but it shouldn't be limited. It should be what are the types of things I really care about when looking at a new role. It could be the type of impact I'm going to have. It could be functional. I only want roles that are in the PM world. It could be industry. I want to work in AI and an AI native company. I will not work if a fintech company wants to hire me, I'm not going to go there. Whatever it is, it could be flexibility, remote first, whatever. Really, there's no right answer here, but just having a blank sheet of paper and listing out what are my priorities when looking for a new role. And the most importantly is stack ranking them. If you know yourself, and there's no shame in this, that comp is your number one priority. I need to have a minimum number, and this is what I need to hit. Make that your number one priority. But if you don't write this out before you start job searching, before you start talking to people, you are going to have a really hard time deciding on like what to pursue. And it's going to feel a little bit like you're just a magnet that's moving towards whatever metal that comes your way. So start with the ranking priorities and make it, expansive as you want, as long as it's ranked. And then the second list you need to make is your deal breakers. Now, this list should not be expensive. I'd say three items would be ideally the max. You could have one or two more, but you're going to really struggle if there's more than 5 things on this list. But you could have as little as one. I wouldn't have zero. Having zero would tell me that you have no boundaries, and that will probably tell your employer that you have no boundaries. But this is a list of non-negotiables. So things that cannot be broken in a new role. That could be if you're being asked to travel. Some people will not want to travel at all or very minimal. Some people are very happy and comfortable with monthly travel for work. It could be the time zone. The company is, if you're working for an American company, if you're based in Australia versus working for a local company, that is something that some people will have a boundary on that I will not work, a certain number, certain, time zone of the day. Whatever is on there is totally up to you. There's no like right thing to have on your deal breakers. The only thing I'll say is, the longer it is, the harder it's going to be to find something that will meet all of your criteria. But this is very different from your priorities. And that's a key differentiator. I think a lot of people confuse the two and they end up not being clear on what's a real priority versus a nice to have. Yeah, and I think in your priorities list, you might end up with a role with only one of your priorities and you might love it. You don't know, right? Like it's hard because some of these things are a bit harder to predict. Whereas deal breakers, I know people who've taken roles where they violated a deal breaker and within a year they had to leave. So you kind of have to decide, what you're willing to do. But again, having deal breakers is going to be really important to make sure you don't inadvertently take a job that is a really bad fit for you and the employer. But the last thing I'll say here is adaptation is important. In this market, things are changing all the time. And it's hard to be very firm in both your priorities and your deal breakers. As long as you know why they're on there, and especially if they align to your values, that's where, being firm is going to be in your favor. But ultimately, when you meet with people, when you meet with your network, you're going to get a better sense of, what are the new normals that are being written in the workplace, because some of these things are no longer, they've shifted over the years. I've added another prompt here. I'm not going to get into it, but please look at it when I share this out and feel free to use it. This is going to help you better target your job search based on your strengths, based on your values. How do you then narrow that down to your, based on all the lists you're creating, so that you can actually get some help in targeting your job search. And then lastly, in this flow of how to, use your time wisely versus rage applying online to jobs, I mentioned that you're very unlikely to find your next job through online applications. I think this is research from Ernst& Young. Only 2% of jobs are found through online applications. So very rare that is how you're going to find your new job. 80% are found through networking. So that's where you're going to get the best bang for your buck, is just reaching out to people you already know, to this community, to friends of friends, people you knew in college, like Jason and Chris, or people that you maybe people you know through your kid's school, whatever it is. There's really not one right place to network, but just being really crisp in your narrative as a start, which I'll share, is going to help you here. But your next job could come from anyone really. And so the first step here is to just not be too insular. I see a lot of people during post-layoff time will really be stuck to their computer and kind of like, how do I engineer my way to a new job? And that's of course there's a lot you can do online to build, to learn. I'm not saying that you should not be spending any time doing that, but making sure you're monitoring how much of your energy and your time are you spending with others. Meeting people in your network is so critical right now. So just making sure you're setting yourself some kind of goal to meet new people, or existing people, but make sure you're actually engaging with them. And then going back to your strengths and your values as a way to do that. Who are the people you have shared values with? Who maybe you have shared interests? Because that's going to make it a more real connection. The second point here is people can tell when you're being transactional, when it's very much a, hey, I need this from you. Can I have it now? And some version of that. And it really turns people off. I'd say for the most part, it's not the best way to engage. But that said, people love to exchange, right? So it's not to say people don't like to help others. I think we all do, and we all love to be helpful. That's a very human need. But the way we do it needs to feel like an exchange, not a transaction. And that's where making sure you're clear on what is it that I think I can learn from this person, or that they can learn from me? What can I share? What can they share with me? Is it an introduction? Is it curiosity? Can I share some insight on how life has been at Atlassian the last few years, what we've learned in this domain? Being really crisp on that when you do outreach, and I've got a prompt to help, can really make sure you're not coming across like you just want something and you need it now. That can be, lead to less sustained relationships. And I mentioned in the previous slides of, you did that exercise to get your strengths clear, your values, and, the problems you've solved, that narrative, making sure you're taking the time to summarize that for an external audience. So that should be really crisp, a few sentences of who you are, if you're meeting somebody new in person, for example, and then a slightly longer summary of what did you solve? Why did you solve these hard problems at Meta that I just mentioned? And then similarly, some really clear, strong questions for them, something that they can remember, that's tailored to them, to their world, to their role, making sure you come prepared to every meeting that you have with a network, every interview with this kind of clear narrative can really help you stand out, where there are a lot of people out there who come to these meetings, and people I've introduced to others or have been introduced to me, where it's really not clear what they want, where they're at. And of course, with people who you're very close with, that can be totally fine. There's nothing wrong with being vulnerable, that you don't know what you want with your closer circle. But when you're being introduced to people who might actually have roles for you or might connect you with others, how do you make sure you show up with more clarity, and that you've got more questions for them? So it's not this very unclear engagement. Another prompt, I'm not going to go through this in the interest of time. We only have 4 minutes, so this is just another one for you to try on that front. And then I'll quickly end with this, and I'll jump through the rest of the slides, and I'll send this to you. There were a couple of people who I've coached through layoff situations, and just wanted to share two very different real life scenarios. One person who I worked with was laid off from Meta, and they had visa challenges. I don't know if that's affecting any of you, but that's a really that can be really stressful and hard. And so she was very methodical and took her time, or was very broad, and reached out to a lot of people in her network, and ended up finding a role through a mother's network from her kid's school. And she loved that role. She's still in it today. This was a while ago, so it was a different job market, but still, it was not, that stress of the visa situation was incredibly difficult. But the most important lesson I think she took away was that being able to talk through with other people her situation, her strengths, her narrative. She got a lot of feedback in those early conversations that led her to then have more productive, impact-based conversations later on, and land a role. And then the second example, I think, is maybe a bit of an anti-example. I coached somebody who got laid off in 2024 from Google. And when he was laid off, he was so quick to find a new role. He was so adamant he needed to find something quickly, and had, very methodical approach to it, and leveled down, found something that was a bit more ground level at a startup. But it was a terrible fit, and he was there for a year, and it was one of the worst years of his life. He really was incredibly stressed out about it. Had a horrible manager who he didn't think was horrible when he, started working there. But it was just I think the reason that it ended up being such a bad fit was he did not really do the work to understand what mattered to him, his priorities, his values. But then when we worked together last year, he realized, like, oh, I actually really, through the hardest way possible, I've learned what I don't want and what I do want and what matters to me. And he ended up leaving the startup that he was working at, found another startup, and now he's loving his role, which is a very, very different kind of company. But it took him that hard lesson of, being a bit too quick to go for the first thing he found that looked good on paper, to realize it was not a good fit for him. So make sure you do the work, otherwise you might learn the hard way. Um, I won't go through this, but there's an assessment on my website that I'll just link to here, that if you're stuck, if you're a little bit like, I don't really know where to get started here, and I don't really know my strengths, and I don't feel like doing this longer LLM exercise, where you can go through this and get a sense of your growth style. What's the way you like to process? What's the way you like to, the types of teams you like to work in? That can be a good starting off point, because I find that no matter what job you have, whether you're a PM, engineer, program manager, etc., often we all have a certain style that we like to work in, and it's our natural best style. So knowing that can really help you choose the right kind of company that fits that style. Um, all right, I flew through that and unfortunately haven't had time for questions, but I'm leaving 1 minute. So if anyone has questions, please do raise your hand or type it in the chat, and I'm happy to answer.
Just wanted to thank you for the time that you've taken to walk us through this. Really appreciate that.
Of course, Norman. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm glad to hear, Melissa, Chelsea.
Sarah, thank you again for doing this. The quick question is, I know you shared samples of when people jumped in to look for a job versus waiting. Like, what is the range and what would you recommend people do? Is it clearly there's no one size fits all, but I feel like a lot of people are always asking, do I start networking tomorrow? Do I wait for a year? Do I wait 6 months? How do you know when you're ready?
It's such a good question. And yeah, the honest answer is there isn't necessarily a time frame. I would say what I typically see is to go through that process of understanding your strengths, your values, and having more informal conversations to get to figure that out. So not really networking conversations takes, I'd say, a month minimum. I'm just being honest. Like, it doesn't take a day. A month is probably where it's accelerated and you don't have much else going on where you really want to introspect. What I've seen most people do successfully is take a bit more time, whether it's 2 weeks or a month or longer, to not do anything, to kind of just like take a break, do, travel, talk to family. That can be very powerful, because I think we're all in our heads too much. I certainly am, and it can help to just like to truly not think about work or think about, very analytical things, for a bit. So yeah, it's a really good question, Chris. But I'd say, like, if you can't answer these questions, the questions I had before about, these on the far right, what's your summary in less than 3 sentences, six, or 120 seconds of the problems you've solved, and then have three strong questions for the person that you're going to meet, you're not ready. I would say if you can't do that, then I would not start networking, because I think you've got some work to do to understand yourself a little bit better. It doesn't mean you can't meet with people. I'm not saying, oh, just don't talk to anyone, but know that you're in more of a discovery mindset versus a solution mindset.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, love that comment, Helen. That it's a reminder to take a step back and focus on values and requirements than just job title. 100%. We're not gonna, I hope this is true for all of you. I'm not gonna have my job title on my tombstone, right? Like, it's all great, but it's not really how we go through life being defined. So how can you define yourself in a more expansive way? All right, I know I'm over time, but if anyone does have a question, I'm happy to hang on for a minute or two and answer. But I hope this was useful, and please don't hesitate to reach out as well if I can help, if I can support you. If you want someone to just gut check your narrative, I'm very happy to do that, and I'll be honest. But I'd say what Chris said at the beginning really resonates. This is very much a process that will go a lot better for you if you can get support from other people to not go through it alone. And I love that you've got this community and you've got the Slack community, because it can really be lonely if you don't have that group around you who can keep you sane, keep cheering you on. So tap into people around you. They can keep you going.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. I guess we can find a way to share the presentation slides some way.
Yeah.
We'll get the recording and the slides. So thank you very much for this. I hope everyone found it useful, obviously from the comments. But yeah, again, everyone don't isolate yourself, reach out. Best of luck with all the things. And yeah, make sure you main thing, don't isolate yourself, reach out. And again, thank you so much for your wisdom, Sarah. This has helped everyone.
Thanks, everyone. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Take care of yourselves.